Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Wherever you are in the world or calling in from today, on behalf of the Qatar Foundation, we hope you and your families are all healthy and safe in these extraordinary times. My name is Jason Twill, and I am the director of the World Cup program for the Qatar Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest edition of Qatar Foundation's Education City Speaker Series. I join you all today from Sydney, Australia, and as is customary here, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I'm calling in from, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and recognize our elders past and present. I'd also like to say Assalamu alaikum and pay my respects and acknowledge Qatari people and their ancestors as well. And I'm excited that Qatar will be my new home next week. For today's Education City Speaker Series topic, we'll be focusing on the concept of regenerative development, how it is complementary but different to sustainability, and importantly, how it can open a pathway towards a safe and prosperous future for life on our planet. Qatar Foundation is one of the key players in Qatar's drive towards a more sustainable, resilient, and prosperous future. And we recognize the actions we take today have a profound effect on all generations to come. That is why QF, through Education City Speaker Series, have brought together local and international experts today to explore how we can shift beyond sustainability and identify long-term systemic solutions to the complex challenges we face in our world through regenerative development and design. To give you a background, Education City Speaker Series and Qatar Foundation's platform that provides audiences with the opportunity to hear from, learn about, and interact with thought leaders on key topics defining our world today. You can watch today's discussion unfold and actually be part of it, either on Microsoft Teams or on Qatar Foundation's Facebook and YouTube channels. Over the next 45 minutes, each of our speakers will give you a perspective on how we can shift beyond sustainability toward a regenerative future, after which we'll be putting some of your questions and comments to them in a 45-minute Q&A session. So please use the Q&A section in this webinar to post questions, and we'll aim to get through as many of them as possible. If you're watching on Microsoft Teams, there is a live translation with subtitles in English, Arabic, French, Spanish, and Italian. And if you would like to post this discussion on your social media channels, we would appreciate if you can use the hashtag #ECSpeakerSeries. I would like to now introduce our fantastic lineup of panelists today. Up first is Ibrahim Mohamed Jaidah, an award-winning architect from Qatar, the man behind a string of world-class architectural projects within the country, including Al Thumama Stadium, one of the key venues for the FIFA World Cup Qatar 2022. He is the group CEO and chief architect at the Arab Engineering Bureau, one of the region's leading architectural firms. And during his career, he's overseen the completion of over 1,500 projects. Ibrahim is also a fervent advocate for sustainability and is a co-founding member of the Qatar Green Building Council. Ibrahim, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I look very much forward into sharing what we know and to learn from everybody on board. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Bill Reed. Bill's an internationally recognized planning consultant, design process facilitator, lecturer, teacher, and author on sustainability and regeneration. He is a principal at Regenesis, Inc., a regenerative design and education organization. Bill's work is centered around regenerative development, a field he's regarded as one of the leading thinkers in the world on. Bill is a founding board member of the United States Green Building Council and a co-founder and key author of the LEED Green Building Rating System, and has consulted on over 200 design commissions, from individual buildings to master plans for entire cities. Bill, we're delighted to welcome you to Education City Speaker Series today.
Well, thanks, Jason. Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here.
Next, we have Dr. Anne Poelina, an active indigenous community leader, filmmaker, and widely respected advocate for the rights of humans and of the earth. Anne is the managing director of Majula Inc., an indigenous not-for-profit organization based in Western Australia, where she works on issues relating to environmental and cultural protection. In a time of climate change and uncertainty, Anne's focusing is on how to combine first law, indigenous science, and the rights of nature, and how these combined can provide solutions for the health of individuals, communities, and the planet. And it's wonderful to have you with us today.
Jaidah buru yaru jugan. So good evening. I'm just acknowledging that we're on Yaru and Jugan country, and I said in my language that it's a wonderful opportunity to have a conversation with friends in the audience and friends on the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Now, I don't want to waste any time because we have an incredible lineup and I want to hear from them most, as I'm sure all of the audience does as well. First question is for Bill, and just to set the scene for this question, sustainability in its contemporary use has permeated our institutions and communities for the better part of 40 years. Yet in that time, humanity has failed to commensurately respond to the speed, scale, and magnitude of the global challenges we face, be it climate change, ocean health, biodiversity loss, or inequality, to name a few. According to the UN estimates, we are now in the first year of the last decade for us to take a meaningful action to address these issues before many of them become irreversible. Bill, for nearly 30 years, you have been a pioneer and advocate for regenerative development and design as a means to not only mitigate humanity's impact on the planet, but to reverse them. Can you please briefly explain what regenerative development is and why it's so important at this decisive moment in human history?
That's a tough assignment, 50 years of bad actions, and we're going to solve it in a couple minutes. But I will make an attempt. So it's just a matter of perspective, I think, and the perspective is dramatic, but it's still something that we can control or actually change our ways. If in this diagram, we, first of all, sustainability in general is a broad subject, and it means many things to many different people. But I think in our hearts, we ultimately know that it means we are sustaining the interconnected processes of life. Without that, we don't have much to go on. We don't have any foundation for fresh water, fresh clean air. So the foundation of our lives is the life around us. And right now, if you look at this diagram, conventional design is what we're doing right now. We build our buildings one step better than breaking the law, as Randy Croxton said years ago. We come along with green, like LEED and Green Star and other rating systems, and those are a matter of making things less bad, more efficient. So we save 50% energy, 70% energy, and that implies that sustainability must be zero. But zero doesn't really exist. We still have impact no matter what happens. And so how do we actually bridge the gap from the damage we cause or the interactions that may be the not thoughtful interactions into actually restoring and engaging life on its own terms and actually developing a relationship with life? So we jump to this side of the screen, this line, and we're into the regeneration side. The beginning of that is restoration. But restoration is actually us doing stuff to nature and hoping it works. But if we actually heal, give the impulse to a wetland or a forest system or a beach dune system or a riparian corridor to self-organize and have the health to self-organize and evolve, it still leaves us out of the equation. And 10 years later, we may not really remember why we restored that and want to build a shopping mall, and we say, well, we can do with half that wetland. We don't need the whole wetland. And we then compromise. We drive ourselves into the ground by making exceptions, continually eating away at the process, the healthy processes of life. So what does it take us as a culture to actually shift to appreciating and knowing our role and relationship with these living systems that support us? And regeneration is a worldview shift where we are actually moving from a transactional relationship. Nature has certain worth. If I do something to nature, well, maybe it will actually give us a little bit cleaner water, to a whole culture that understands that our role is to tend nature, to tend the wild, as Kat Anderson says in her book. So moving, we can also imagine that if we solve, whatever that means, to solve climate change, there are the carbon in the atmosphere, there are so many other ways we are negating and destroying the planet. Even if we solve climate change, we are still on a downward trajectory. So this means that we're actually need to engage in multiple areas at the same time, which takes a whole culture to do so. So regenerative development is developing the capacity and capability of a culture in each place to engage with life on its own terms. And it's a reciprocal relationship, one that is a relationship of love, if you will. So another thing about place, and I'll finish up with my summary, is that we can't really save the world. The world is too abstract, it's too big. There's no chief or CEO of the planet. So what we can do is save the world place by place. And each place is different and requires us to engage in a unique way in each unique place on the planet. So regenerative development is about developing the capability to participate in the processes of evolution. I think we'll hope that helps to some degree, and I'm sure Dr. Ann and Ibrahim will help define that a little more finitely and with more detail.
That's a great start, Bill, and it's a great segue to our next question, which is for Dr. Ann Poelina. And sustainability, from my perspective in training, is a very Western conceived concept. Many would argue that its primary flaw has to do with the fact that the definition and its concept is derived from a worldview that separates humans from nature. Much of what informs regenerative development and paradigms are coming from indigenous ways of thinking, being, and knowing, and knowledge that has been around for many thousands of years. From my own experience, I know there is much for the world to learn from first peoples of the world. In that regard, Anne, as an indigenous woman, can you please share some insights on who you are and how you associate with the land and regenerative development within your culture and community?
Thank you very much, Jason. I think one of the things is to understand that Indigenous people have a deep and profound relationship with country. This is about relationship. This is about learning about values and ethics and how we place ourselves in the world. When I introduce myself in my language, I go, Ngayu Martuwarra Manan, which means I am a woman who belongs to the Fitzroy River, the Martuwarra. This is not to be seen in terms of property rights, but rather to understand that this is a deep relationship that my people have had for over 60,000 years with this living water system. So we see nature very much as being alive, with a living spirit, with a force, with an energy system that we really rely on to coexist in a symbiotic relationship with country, with nature, with people, with non-human beings. When we are born as an Indigenous person, we are given a totem, an animal, that we form a bond, a lifelong bond, to teach us about an ethics of care. We also learn that animals can teach us how to live and coexist in the world. So it's very, very important to understand, in a world of complexity where we still have elitism amongst humans, how can we bring human beings into a place-based regional governance approach that shows that we must understand all of the systems that we're dealing with. So Indigenous knowledge is ancient wisdom. It must be factored into modernity. It influences systems thinking at so many levels. In my country, we were the first farmers, we were the first engineers, we were the first architects, the scientists from multiple disciplinary perspectives. We lived in a relationship where we understand what nature can provide, but it's not about consumerism. It is all about relationship. It is always about realizing that nature is a living being. It has a right to exist, not just for itself, but for the well-being of the planet and for humanity. So what we are teaching others as Indigenous people is to understand that we must come into a world and see ourselves as people who protect the commons for the greater common good, rather than the predatory elite for the greater good of a few. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was fantastic. And it's a really great segue again to Ibrahim, which the next question is to, and how do we bring this thinking locally into Qatar? One of the anchor tenets of regenerative development, Ibrahim, is the concept of place-source potential, a way of allowing design to emerge from a deep history, culture, and geography of place. I can see this in your work from what I've seen online in our discussions before this talk today, both in Qatar and internationally. And I think your master plan for a traditional neighborhood is brilliant. Human scale, drawing on the cultural context of your people and its culture. And it's the hallmark of a truly skilled architect. So as an architect, can you please share with us how you draw on from ancestral knowledge and heritage landscape in your place, and how that informs your work and your practice, and what you've learned from this?
Well, I lived in these old neighborhoods when I was born, and I grew up in these old neighborhoods, but then went to university abroad. And when I came back, I started restudying why would the people who gathered here manage, and how did they manage to live in a place that it could get so hot as 55 degrees with the humidity in certain times. How did they manage to live? And there is a lot of things for us to learn, the qualities of the things that they have learned that we can implement in our new modern buildings. And I've realized that they were simply sensitive to the environment around them. They were very conscious of every breeze of wind, of the movement of the sun. And I started studying even the buildings, the openings, and it was so sensitive to these elements of nature. And interestingly, we did recently, or a couple of years ago, a study with Harvard. They reconstructed the old town, and they did a thermal study on it. And it's proven that the temperature will drop by 10 to 15 degrees, even in some areas, without any electricity, without air conditioning, just simply being sensitive to the environment around you. Now, if we don't take these qualities and implement them into our building, it will be really over-consuming energy for no reason. Glass buildings, and we pump air conditioning, and we consume energy, and we waste energy. That's not really sensitive to the environment. So definitely there is so much to learn from what our ancestors has built for us. And this does not only apply to our part of the world. This applies to any place in the world. There is a lot to learn from our ancestors.
Thank you for that, Ibrahim. That was great. I'm going to share a personal journey of my 7 years in Australia to lead up to another question for Dr. Poelina. I've been practicing and studying sustainability and regenerative development for the better part of 15 years, for regenerative development, sustainability for about 20. I've been living in Australia for 7 years, and I've had the privilege of being mentored by a few Aboriginal elders, and I can say the education and knowledge I've been given, it knocked me back to kindergarten. As advanced education as I got in graduate schools and teaching around the world, from what I've learned from the ancestor of the land I'm sitting on here today, really was a process of unlearning what I was taught in schools from K through 12 and higher education. So Anne, how do we unlearn these Western mindsets when it comes to regenerative development? And there is this, we talk about this process of unlearning to ensure indigenous communities have a seat at the table in these global dialogues. And what I see as some of the most exciting work happening in the world right now is how we're fusing traditional ecological knowledge and Western science to come up with modern solutions to our most pressing challenges.
Yeah, thank you. I think the first thing is to be able to go and see this ancient wisdom as having relevance in modernity. And what we're saying is that this is an ancient knowledge system that has been generated over at least 60,000 years in this country. So I think one of the things is to really look at how do we value this indigenous knowledge? How do we see it as wisdom that really needs to ground where we're going as a society, in terms of all of us are human beings. All of us, I say, are indigenous to Mother Earth. How do we embed these values that have come from the land, which is earth-centered, which is grounded in relationships, which is grounded in a circular economy of multiple values? You know, one of the things is reciprocity is a fantastic way to be able to sustain what we're talking about, because it can't just be about sustainable development. It must be about sustainable life. And the knowledge and the wisdom that's rooted in this land is profound. And what we're saying is that we are coming with a gift of wisdom and knowledge and love. We say the land and the living waters are alive, that they hold memory, that they are powerful, that they hold the memory of our ancestors wherever we have come from across the planet. I think it's time, as I said, not just to see how we dominate nature, but how we start to get equity as human beings with each other, so that we can bring this collective wisdom in to be able to influence the way we need to go. So from that perspective, I think there's a great deal that we can teach. One, in our own country, our own nation, Australia. One of the things that we're saying is that this is not in a time where Black Lives Matter, but this is critical in a time where indigenous wisdom matters. So what we're saying is that we are coming with an open heart and a gift for humanity that's coming from the work that we are doing in this nation. So the work that I'm doing has a ripple effect. It's connected to other indigenous people. And what we're saying is that this is a critical time, particularly in COVID, where we need to bring all of this together, look and value this knowledge and bring it into the systems thinking. So it's not just about sustainable lives and sustainable development, but how do we heal the lands from the traumas that we have inflicted as human beings? Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Now, Ghana, I want to shift from how we go from theory to practice and have another question for Bill. In the last 20 years, you've worked on a lot of projects with a lot of different and diverse clientele. From your experience, how has using the regenerative development process, what are the most tangible benefits you feel have been created from that process versus other projects you worked on that might have been just going for a LEED certification, so to speak?
All right. Well, I hope building on what Dr. Ann is saying, is that regenerative development doesn't happen out there, it happens in here. And without developing one's individual capability to self-actualize, as Maslow said, actually develop, it requires the self to actually be whole, become whole, the groups that you're working with to actually function in a much more integrated way to serve the system. So it's self, group, and system development. And so that's the hardest leap for people to make, because they think that they're hiring us to do a project. When in fact, what we're working on is working on the health of the system. So the profound shift is that you're actually working on a project by working on the health of the dynamics of life out here. And then that informs the project. So the project is actually in relationship to supporting and adding value to the system that it's part of. Is that making some sense? I can actually unpack that more.
It is, and maybe to make it more tangible, maybe share the Brattleboro market story in a couple minutes, and how it moved the project and the team from a different way of thinking about the project when you brought in the regenerative paradigm.
Well, that's a simple one, and I'd like to give a little more deeper one. So this was a grocery store, and the grocery store was going to be a LEED Gold grocery store. And the nature of a food store, though, is that it actually, the most of the energy is contained, if you will, in shipping the food. It's an average of 3,600 miles in the United States for every bite of food. And so this grocery store, instead of building a LEED Gold grocery store, which they did, it was more important to reestablish the local food network. And so that's what we worked on, is the restoring the health of the forest, restoring the ability to grow food in one's backyards, providing credit unions to help loan money for farmers to reestablish themselves in the area because they'd all gone bankrupt or moved out. So the system became the work, and the grocery store almost incidental. And as the president of the co-op said, the building is this was an acupuncture point to begin to heal the system. In the larger scheme of things, I'll give you an example of Playa Viva, this little eco resort that we worked on in Mexico. It was not just about hiring local people to function as waiters and managers and service people in the resort and giving them benefit of jobs. when we got there and started developing a relationship with the local village, the owner realized how brilliant they were and realized this is not about us occupying some land next to a village. It's we are the village. And so this became an opportunity to reestablish healthy soil, healthy food, healthy lagoons and water systems, and develop a whole network of self-reinforcing benefits, to the point where tourists there, visitors, invest in that community because they fall in love with the work in the community. They become part of the community, and then they take that perspective back home. The bottom line, though, it took about 5 or 6 years for the best metric of all is that the teenagers started moving back to town because there was a thriving social, ecological whole community. It wasn't just a resort off to the side. So that's the beginning of regenerating this kind of unity of relationship that's required between not only people to people, but people to land. I'll stop there. I can keep going. There's lots of projects, but I hope that illustrates.
It's great. I mean, I see a pattern across a lot of the projects I hear you're involved with and others in our network are involved with, that we're moving away from this notion of building buildings to building culture, aligning with what Anne's saying as well. And I want to shift again to Ibrahim a bit now and talk about how this is being embraced. I know there's been a fervor of explosive work. I mean, infrastructure, stadiums, metros. Qatar has been building its whole country over the last decade in an incredibly sustainable manner. The Supreme Committee, all the architects, engineers in the country have been really focusing on driving one of the most sustainable World Cups ever held, which is a phenomenal feat. Do you see, you've had some time to digest what regenerative development is. What opportunities do you see for regenerative development in Qatar, knowing we have this beautiful national vision for 2030, the values of the country, its culture? Do you see an opportunity for this model to kind of take hold and scale up in Qatar?
Well, there are tons of opportunities. If we go back a little bit in history, whether in Qatar or in the region, the amount of construction that has been done in the last, say, 20, 25 years was more than what we built in the last 100 years. So there is tremendous growth. And we are fortunate that we have realized in the last decade or so that we have overconsumed our part of the earth, building so much, as good as it may sound, with the infrastructure and so on. So there was some challenges, but we realized that. And in the footsteps that we've taken in the last 10 to 15 years, we have really recovered and we are regenerating a lot of things. I mean, just to give you an example, in the last 3 years, Qatar has managed to increase its food securities by 400%. If we continue with this, we'll be self-efficient in a handful number of years. Having that said, in terms of the food securities, but also in the design environment, the way the new neighborhoods are being designed, it's bringing the qualities of what has gone with all tremendous growth in terms of social, even socially, and reflecting that even to the bigger picture of the World Cup, of the way the infrastructure is being done. Sustainability has been a major issue, and this to regenerate by building all these facilities, we're talking about even the legacy. How we're going to continue living with these big buildings? How are we going to rehabilitate them for the people to make use of them? We've seen what happened to other countries when they hosted these stadiums, became white elephants, and it was cheaper to demolish them rather than to maintain them. Here, for every designer, as when we designed even the competition and the stadium that we are doing, part of the competition is how you're going to rehabilitate this building after the event. And we had to look at the bigger picture of all the neighborhood. The stadium is going to be part of that part of the town society. It's going to become parks, it's going to become educational, it's going to become medical. I think it's quite important to start regenerating. I love the idea of regenerating because it goes beyond your typical sustainability. As Bill said in his introduction, sustainability at its best, you reach zero emission. And Bill said zero emission is a dream. You never even reach zero emission. So, but if we even the whole world reaches zero emission, we will be at the bad situation globally where we are. We overconsumed our earth. I think to regenerate is the answer for us to give what we seen or what our fathers seen to our generations to come.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I actually have a follow-up question for you. And if anyone's heard me speak before, I often make a claim that our biggest challenge is not climate change, it's human change. And we have to start pointing the finger back at ourselves. And largely our task is, how do we create this cultural and behavioral shift in humanity so that every individual has that sense of responsibility and understanding their own impacts on the planet, and how collectively as a species we work towards planetary health. Knowing that, how do you see regenerative development aligning with Arab and Islamic faith and cultural heritage? Do you see the connection points between the Quran and what regenerative development espouses to be, and where it can take us?
It's an extremely interesting question, and it's good that Jason, we spoke about this a couple of days ago, and I started digging deeper in this subject, in the culture and how the religion sort of put the guidelines for this. And I realized as I started digging that the Holy Quran actually has a number of specific references to ecology, and also to contain some important principles of the environmental conservation. The first principle which guides the Islamic teaching on environmental sustainability is the concept of trusteeship. We've been entrusted to save and to keep this earth to the generations to come. Each man is a custodian of nature. This is, I'm quoting from the religion itself, that each man is a custodian of nature and must live with harmony with other creatures, not only with other humans. Even the bird that comes, you're not entitled to deprive the bird from drinking from your fountain or from your river. This is made for all of us. It's quite interesting and deep, and it's also establishing a degree of need. You can use this earth, you can use whatever is available on earth based on what you need, and we have to define here need have to be distinguished from wants. Our wants are much bigger than what we need, but when we talk about nature, the resources, we have to use what we need, not to. And the impact of the utilization of natural resources it should be sacred, a trust invested in mankind. Mankind is, again, I'm quoting, mankind here is the manager, not the owner, the beneficiary and not the disposer. And according to the Islamic law, the basic elements of nature, land, water, fire, forest, light, belongs to all living things, not only us humans. So this is basically the findings that I found about how the religion and the culture has. And I remember the sayings of even the older generation. You know, there was one water well for the neighborhood, and everybody took what they required. Nobody has abused it. Everybody made sure it's clean for everybody to share with. And all these qualities, I think, are extremely important for us to continue living happily on this globe for the generations to come.
Bill, did you want to add something to Ibrahim's dialogue here?
I think so. It may not be the right point, Jason, but I wanted to talk about how, building on what everybody's been saying, how this actually gets practically implemented. Is this now a good time for this, or should we wait?
No, go for it.
Well, give me the
desires.
give me the hook if it goes down the wrong way. But this is not really that hard to do. And so we're talking large abstractions, but in reality, this is helping people to fall in love with life again. And this happens place by place, as all of us have been talking about, because place, actually, we can, as Ibrahim said, we can actually act responsibly because we can see the impact of our decisions. But if we focus on solving individual fragmented problems piece by piece, we will end up in a bunch of silos only partially solving problems because everything is connected. So if we can actually enlarge the scope, not reduce the scope, but enlarge the scope of what we are addressing, we can get everybody engaged in working towards that, what we call potential, the health of a city, let's say, and its ecosystem. And we can show people what's possible and then integrate and get people to meet to work towards that larger system. People begin to respond with their particular specialties, whether it's racial inequality or climate change or habitat connectivity or mobility, whatever issue that you're particularly interested in. By getting everybody engaged, working towards the health of the larger system, it is remarkable what happens. People begin to work together in ways that we never worked together in this siloed, fragmented way of our political Western, I'll call it Western politics.
Western politics. No, it's great. And it's a great lead in that I want to kind of address the role of regenerative education today and helping cultivate the mindset mental model we're talking about in children in a time where, if anyone's read Richard Love's book, Last Child in the Woods, there's a medical condition called nature deficit disorder because children aren't as connected to nature as they've been in previous generations. How are we starting that learning journey for these next generations to become the custodians we're talking about, becoming custodians of Earth, becoming custodians of life? And it starts in pre-K, and it's a learning journey. And I know you and I have both been familiar in the halls of universities around the world. But last year, you're one of a number of authors who argued that universities have a responsibility to prepare students for our uncertain future that we're facing. What do you feel is education's role in regenerative development? And what does it need to do that's not currently doing now?
Yes, I think there's some really interesting questions to be had in regards to the way universities have started to become developed. There was a time when I first entered the university system where it was looking at how do we create and invest in creative, innovative human beings, encouraging them into the science, into humanities, in all of these different things. So we're in a situation at the moment in my nation state where anybody undertaking a humanity or arts degree are paying twice the amount of money as someone doing hard sciences. So we are really stifling the creativity of human thought by crippling people into systems thinking, which is very hardcore wired. And those who want to be liberating and to have a concept of how do we reimagine or how do we dream the new dream of where we need to go in terms of humanity are looking at this in sort of quite complex situation at the moment where, because of COVID, we've got systems that are having to downsize, young people paying twice as much for, certain degrees, and we're saying we're investing in humanity. I don't think so. I think one of the things is to go back to Ibrahim's first story about it's all about story. When I talk about first law, I talk about what are the stories that taught us coming through our world as indigenous people about values, about ethics, that the Creator created not just human beings, but multi-species that also have a right to justice. So when we're looking about this systems thinking, I think we need to unpack that a lot of the revolutionary thinking is not happening in universities. It's happening outside of these closed systems that are now being developed mainly on the purview of being business. So I think we need to be quite clever. We need to be innovative. We need to bring a wide range of collective wisdom into how do we start to look at how do we learn and unlearn, and how do we look at what's happening globally and bring that locally. All of these things are really, really important. But one of the things I do want to go back to is when I talk about first law, they are the stories that have come from the beginning of time through our Creator. And it doesn't matter. This is not about religion. This is about spirituality. This is about energy. This is about life supporting systems. So what we need to do is be open to the potential of what does it mean to bring all of these ways, all of this collective wisdom into growing decent, ethical, creative, ethical human beings to be able to be fit for purpose in regards to the challenges that we are leaving our young people. So it's just to think of education as something that's really broad, that we can reach our full potential through so many different ways, that we cannot be biased and think that we have an elitist system of learning when the knowledge of Indigenous people are only just starting to get into those systems. So to look beyond institutions to see how human beings are mobilizing, how we are creating free thought and free thinking, how are we working together wherever we are on the planet to bring about multi-species justice, because it must be justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And I know when you started to introduce yourself, I'm going to add a follow-up question that for you first, but all of the panelists can answer, which is the importance of language and how language can help shape human consciousness. And I know I work for a foundation that's working tirelessly to preserve Arabic language. You spoke in your native tongue and how that had a relationship to the river where you're from. And I see this incredible transformation happening in a nearby country to Australia, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which has a single Indigenous language that a lot of non-Indigenous Western people are now speaking. And what I love about Indigenous languages, or many languages, is that there's multiple meanings for different words and multiple dimensions to those words, where there is a relationship to a mountain or the river. It's a brother, a sister, a cousin, the trees. And just I've seen, a shift of consciousness happening in New Zealand with Westerners because they're speaking the language and it's connecting them differently to their place. Can you just describe briefly, Anne, how language plays a role in your culture in helping raise that kind of thinking and attitudes in your community?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I think it's a really tricky one, because a lot of people come into this with, oh, we're doing regenerative agriculture, we're doing bioregional planning, we're doing earth-based governance. And in our language, we say that our land and our living waters don't understand English. So from that perspective, it makes you start to understand that you've got to unpack not just language, and what you have to do is what our elders say, you must look at what connects you to meaning of life, meaning to relationships, meaning of how we are taught from animals to survive, how we say that our living water systems are fully allocated, and that all of these things really require not just energy, but balance and synchronicity of all of us working together in harmony. So what I'm saying is that, most of the communication we have between our people is non-verbal. We want you to feel the country. We want you to hear the landscape. And so sometimes with all the noise of communication and language, we can miss the power of what the language and the river and the animals are teaching us. So we have to be quiet, not so much more communication. We have to be quiet. We need to feel the land. We need to know that it is a living system with a right to exist and coexist with us, that our world and our lives are so dependent on nature and these living systems being healthy. So from that perspective, it's a really interesting question. But as I say, my country, my language, my culture took a long time to understand English. And I think the most powerful word that I would leave in this conversation right now is to understand that for my people, we have gone on a journey of 150 years of colonization. And what we're saying from our lived experience is that we can teach our fellow Australians, we can teach the world what it means to be colonized and how we are now being colonized by the multinationals, and that it is all of our duty of care and love to understand that to be a human being is a gift from the Creator, and we must not think about that lightly. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Bill, do you want to add anything to that? I know you've done you've trained thousands and thousands of people in multiple countries around the world, and I know in your curriculum, language is really critical with the way you're teaching as well. And you're very precise in the words you choose to teach to others, to help, I would assume, to help reprogram, rewire their minds.
Well, that's right. And I can't say it better than Dr. Ann said, but I can add some dimension to it, and that we do try to destabilize English, or we do try to destabilize language because we use it very sloppily. But that's a bigger topic. I think just to keep it simple, I think English is a real problem. And English is a noun-oriented language. And as a result, everything is a thing. It's a deliverable. It's give me something. And it's the biggest barrier that we have to working with clients is we aren't here offering something. We're offering what, well, to the best of my ability, what Dr. Ann is talking about, is this reconnection with the dynamics of life. And that understanding and that being and becoming is what is so essential. It's not the building, it's not the object. And so as Bucky Fuller said, you know, we need to start speaking in verbs, not nouns.
Thank you. And I agree, I can't say it any, like you, I can't say it any more beautiful than Ann says it. Thank you, Ann, again, for your contribution, and for Bill on adding to that as well. I'm going to shift now to the Q&A, if everyone's okay with that. We're at 45 minutes, and I'm going to start with a question from Jose on MS Teams. This one is to Ibrahim. Ibrahim, are there any opportunities in Qatar where regenerative development can be applied? Any habitats that would benefit from regenerative development?
Yes, certainly there is. Actually, I'm working on something really exciting, which is recreating the old neighborhood, but that suits the modern life. The young, educated, I mean, we still have cars, we have the internet and so on, but I've taken the qualities of the courtyard, which give us not only a better environment, but the privacy, which relates to the culture. And we're trying to recreate a neighborhood of the qualities of the older neighborhood in a very contemporary way, and taking the ingredients of what we learned from our ancestors and adopting it. And in that, we're trying to regenerate the whole social aspects of what we missed. As the new planners came in the 70s, they did these cul-de-sacs and the grid system, and they we ended up designing boxes called villas, deprived us from privacy. Everybody became a prisoner to the inside of the houses. Now I'm hoping with this new neighborhood, and it's getting quite accepted by the authorities, to be recreated and to add a nice regenerative aspects of the old neighborhoods. We're talking even about how to recreate within these neighborhoods Friday markets or Saturday markets, and how to plant within these neighborhoods even basic things, because every old house had a tree, a palm tree that you can even eat the dates of the palm. So we're trying to recreate this, and it's really getting wonderful reaction from the policymakers, and we could see this happening hopefully the first quarter of next year. Something like that will start coming to life. So there are opportunities. Actually, we are desperate for such opportunities, for what we've lost with this tremendous growth. And this may apply to any other cities within, I think, the world. So there are definitely opportunities, and we are exploring it as we go.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I have a question from MS Teams that is to Bill. How do you see the future of regenerative development taking hold in the Arab world, since it has a different nature and geography compared to the Western parts of the world?
Okay. That is a question that is place-based. It really doesn't matter where you are. It matters that you actually address where you are. And so what is the nature of a healthy ecosystem around the Arab Gulf, let's say? And that question is the first question that needs to be asked. And then how do we serve that in our projects? So the area, I'll tell you, just one thing we spoke about the other day, the salinity of the Arab Gulf is actually incredibly high now because of the desalination plants. It's double what the ocean should be. It's close to 6% salination, which is 3. So that's a direct implication on how fresh water is obtained and needs to be addressed before that sea is dead. But the desert is full of life. And as Ibrahim was saying, that we used to know how to live in the desert very comfortably without any kind of additional resources, or additional energy resources. So how do we get back to that? And we can do it. We could spend a long time talking about the details, but it's very possible. Hassan Fatih, a famous architect in the 40s and 50s, demonstrated a lot of what Ibrahim was talking about. Ibrahim, do you know about Hassan? You know Hassan Fatih, Egyptian architect?
Yes, Hassan Fatih is a very well known. The late Hassan Fatih, he recreated the neighborhoods in Egypt and the southern part of Egypt extremely successfully. The mud houses, and he built also in New Mexico a magnificent project there.
We study him in the States too. He's that respected. So
brilliant. His books are amazing.
What's that, Jason?
His books are amazing. Housing for the Poor. It's amazing. He's an amazing architect. I'm glad you brought him up, actually. I have a question for Anne on MS Teams. How can we connect the past to the present in this context? More precisely, how can we reconnect with Mother Earth?
That's a very good question. In my language, we have a word called bugaragara. And bugaragara, some people may say, is the dream time. No, it's not. Bugaragara means the past, the present, and the future, fused into this moment in time in which we must act ethically as decent human beings. So from that perspective, what we must do is learn from our ancestors, learn from the ancient wisdom, look at how our life has progressed over the last 150 years to bring us to this state of crisis right now. What and how do we dream the new future, whether it's through regenerative roadmaps, whether it's through, in Australia, what we are calling the regenerative songline. What we're saying is that we need to be looking at how do we dream and actualize the future in the now. So I think that's a really powerful way to be able to conceptualize that. Everything is entwined. Time for us is not in a linear way, it is in a circle. So we must start something, we must do our bit, and we must commit to the future from our learnings from the past. So very, very critical in terms of fusing all of those concepts into this moment now, where we must be duly diligent and do the best thing for young people, not just in the future, but young people who are living now.
Thank you. This would be for all of you, actually, because it'd be interesting to hear how governments are responding to this topic in different parts of the world. The question is, how are you seeing governments and international organizations across the world take hold of this concept of regenerative development in their policies and governance models? And I might ping Bill on that one just to prompt you with the Common Earth and Commonwealth initiative we've been working on.
Sure. The positive side is that there are governments and government agencies, and the Commonwealth of Nations is one, with Baroness Patricia Scotland leading the charge in terms of regenerating the Earth to address climate change. And they're calling that initiative Common Earth. And so developing relationships with at least all the Commonwealth countries and more to begin to trade and exchange perspectives on this way of thinking. So that's the most powerful activity that I've seen on the planet as a whole. There are a number of other nations, New Zealand is one, of course, that are actively thinking this way. But many are, unfortunately, I want to caution, many people are using regeneration as a synonym for sustainability, or as just another term to bring us back to business as usual, which is basically negating the power. What's that?
Less bad.
Less bad, yeah. So we have to be careful. This is why words are powerful, right? If we actually define words by looking at what we've done in the past, it prevents us from committing to the future, as Dr. Ann said.
Thank you for that. And do you have any insights on how you see the Australian government responding to this, particularly in light of the bushfires from last year?
Well, there's so many things going on here. I think what we need to look at is to be very clear that what we are saying as Indigenous Australians is that we've lived a journey of 150 years of colonisation and oppression. And what we're saying is that this is time to reconceptualise what does freedom mean? What does it mean to be a free human being? What does it mean to be someone who can be free thinking and all of those sorts of things? So we're still on a journey in our nation state where we have not unpacked what does it mean to be colonised. And what we're saying as Indigenous people is because we've lived through that experience, we can now transform that learning, because many of us in our nation states are now being colonised by the multinationals. And that's what my country was opened up for. People came from the resources, but they did not respect what was here. We have taken a long journey of saying we are now dreaming the new dream of what does it mean to be free. And so what we're saying is that we need to reconceptualize our systems thinking. We need to think of ourselves as people who've been colonized. How do we conceptualize that so that our freedom can then be bestowed to our fellow nationals, who then can say in a time of great uncertainty that we really need to redefine who we are as Australians. We need to see ourselves as part of the bigger collective of humanity, and we need to reach out, first of all, to heal and have truth and reconciliation among Indigenous nations, and that way our nation can be free. But there's much to learn from Indigenous people in regards to the colonial journey and how we are perceptionizing the way that we are bringing in our dream of what does it now mean to be free in our own nation state. So lots of things going on, plenty of laws being reformed, plenty of interesting deficit approaches to public policy, but we could not do this without hope and love in our heart and believing that there is an opportunity to work with fellow Australians and indeed the world to show that we in Australia, we Indigenous people, are coming with this gift of wisdom. We need to partner with people who believe in the story and want to be able to take that journey and be able to take it out into the world and for all of us to be free.
Ibrahim, do you want to share any insights on that with Qatar?
Indeed, I do. I'm loving and enjoying what the panel is saying. I'm learning, and it's really making me also appreciate what we are going through here. Within the 2030 vision, we went, I guess, throughout the years, we went beyond. I mean, sustainability, like Bill said, this is not the issue here, and now we are happy. Sustainability became even a legislation. But in Qatar now, again, in the last 15 years or 20 years or so, there has been a comeback to what we have missed in terms of our culture. You know, there are less than 500,000 Qataris, so to speak. And we've realized with the fast changes that happened, we could easily lose our culture. So within this 10, 15 years, this comeback to even our origins of our musicals, our poetry, our social relationship with our neighbors, there has been a massive comeback to that. And I think we're literally going through a regenerative process now to appreciate what we have, to build on it, and to be able to continue on it. You wouldn't believe it. My kid, 12-year-old, is more deeper in his culture than myself because of the way they are taught now in school and how the culture around them is teaching him how to go. I think we are going through an interesting footsteps now that after hearing all this, to appreciate what we are going through. And I'm glad that we are also part of it, at least as architects and planners, to help put that into context, to help that process.
Thank you for that. I'm going to shift to a question from Fangari on MS Teams. To apply sustainability as a basis in the construction market is a challenge, since the business needs are mostly focused on, or mostly dilute sustainability aims to focus on private sector needs for profit. How do we find solutions to balance needs and wants within the private sector? That can probably be to Ibrahim.
Well, Bill wanted to say something, but
you raised his hand.
I'll say something since
Yeah,
I'm on the speaker. It goes back to the planners and to the legislations. In a nutshell, the developers will continue to be greedy to get the best out of it. Some of them, unfortunately, care less for what's happening around them, but it's all in the legislations and the planning. But I'm sure we'll hear something interesting from Bill now.
Yeah, thanks, Ibrahim. This is one of those really frustrating points. We have found consistently over the last 25 years of work in both an integrative and regenerative practice that we save capital costs, not just operating costs, time to market, and because we have incredibly satisfied community members. And now we have actually met developers, we're talking major developers in the States, who, when they buy property, do not propose a project. They work with the community for 1 to 2 years before they propose a project. And as a result, they get approvals for their projects within months, as opposed to never. And as they said, and these are people that actually have the community first, but they also say, and we laugh all the way to the bank, because the market will reward this kind of, if you will, behavior, this kind of care. It's just that we don't think it will. And I can give hundreds of examples of projects that have saved significant money by making an effort to organize and align people around higher purpose. But we assume that business as usual is the only way to do things. I don't know if that's a sufficient answer, but I want to create a teaser for you, because this stuff really works.
I'll add to that, because it's kind of my discipline as being I've been a development project director for 20 years, and I've had to work with Bill and colleagues around the world to apply these principles and help us push into a living building paradigm or regenerative development paradigm. In addition to shifting the culture and design process to achieve better economic performance on construction projects, we're still battling with a misalignment of values. So we don't currently accurately value natural capital, social capital, human capital, and cultural capital when it applies to physical buildings and cities. We need to expand our notion of value, and that's not aligning to this kind of 20th century economic paradigm that we're still sitting under. That's a large umbrella that we're sitting under that doesn't really enable us to invest in this past a certain point. And there's a lot of people in the world working on a regenerative economy or a regenerative economic model, including the Commonwealth and many organizations around Europe and the United States and in Australia. So it's happening. It's not happening fast enough, but doing that will start to alleviate, when you start to have a total cost and total value proposition for an industry like the construction sector, it'll start to shift the behavior of investors and builders to enable us to go farther and delivering better performing assets.
And it's already happening.
It is already happening. Yeah. This is a question this is from Ahmed on MS Teams. Do you think earth-shaped houses can be considered a good manifestation of regenerative architecture? I'll go with Bill on this one and probably shift to Ibrahim, because this is the architect.
Thanks. That's a great question, and I'm going to deflect it a little bit, because a building cannot be regenerative. I'm going to be a little geeky here about precision in language. Is that living systems, things that are alive, things that replicate, things that evolve, can be regenerative. Buildings themselves only suffer entropy. They only suffer second law of thermodynamics. But it is the people within the buildings that become regenerative. And so it's a good thing to build Earth ships, but they're not. Imagine an Earth filled with 100 million Earth ships. Have we saved the planet? I don't think so. So there's a whole bunch of larger systems, a whole bunch of other things, larger systems that we have to engage in. And building like that give us the impetus to think more deeply, is about the best that we can say about green buildings.
There's a question on MS Teams to Anne. Knowing that Mother Earth has sent us to our rooms this year, how has the planet been affected by this pandemic? Like, what are the consequences? Are they positive or negative?
I think that is definitely an interesting question. I think we're still trying to work out what is the best way to get out of this. When you look around the different nation states, there's so many different ways that people are trying to work out what is the solution to the pandemic that's been created. I think one of the things it's made me reflect on is the importance and the value of family. Like, I find it very difficult that it has been so traumatic for some families to live together in such close proximity for such a large period of time. And that's actually, for some families, been quite terrifying. So, you know, it made me reflect and think, okay, if this is about relationship, how does that teach us to value each other a bit more? And that goes back into the conversation we had a little bit earlier about trying to look at how do we maximize profit from the infrastructure we're making so that we get a better return. But the better return must be the well-being of family and community. And so some of these things that we're seeing as value, we talk about it as wealth being, because we live in a capitalist system. We do need some economics, but all the other forms of capital help us to reach our full potential as a human being. So being able to see how can we bring all these different ways together, all these different values, all the things that we want to share and learn. So one of the things that COVID has taught us is how to be more creative and communicate in a way that is meaningful and relevant using technology. I come from a culture that really doesn't do the AI and the IT thing, so I'm a little bit nervous, but it's teaching us that there is value in our young people who are connected to global culture. And so young people are learning to become entrepreneurial journalists, storytellers, researchers, holding culture, sharing culture, but through a modern way of storytelling. So it creates within us an opportunity to be creative, to really deep down and dive into the relationships of those people who are so close to us, extend that out to the community, and move to a place of communityism, from the me to the we. And I think that's what I've learned more from COVID, by being extremely isolated. I found it a blessing not to be able to travel. I mean, the number of keynote opportunities I've had globally would not have come my way if COVID hadn't occurred. So we've got to look at the positives, we've got to look at the negatives, but we must look at how do our nation states right-size themselves, invest in family and community, and shift some of the wealth creation into equitable distribution of sharing the benefits so that all of our families can reach their full potential and do the things that we need to do as human beings.
Thank you, Anne. I thought that was a great question. And I think the pandemic visually demonstrated how human activity impacts planetary health. When you saw the reintroduction of dolphins in the Venice canals in Italy, or smog lift over cities like Beijing, and the planet started to heal itself when there was less human activity. So there's that direct positive correlation. So with your call to action, which you just said, Anne, is really important, that we can't just snap back to where we were. We have to build back better, which is a great message happening across the world right now, and go beyond. This is a question for Ibrahim. Sorry, they just scrolled through here. How do we create more awareness among people and businesses in Qatar, where fossil fuels are still the main source of energy and consumption, and consumption is at an all-time high?
Well, we have to, I guess, educate the developers into building a more efficient buildings. But going back also, which is part of this issue, going back to even the highest return on this development. I try to convince some of my clients, you know, if your building can take 100 units, make them 80, and return of, because when they calculate occupancy, they say it's 60% occupancy, 70%. So your building will never be full as such. So why don't you sacrifice the 20 units out of the 100, create more courtyards, more pleasant spaces, where the building becomes inhabitable and less emission, maybe regenerative in the sense of whatever you're going to plant there, it's going to help the environment, and definitely it's going to be 100% occupied with the 80 units rather than sitting and waiting for looking at your empty 20 or 30 units. So there are ways that you can reduce the emission and still continue to build. It's interesting, we have a new zone called Lusail. It's a new part of town, a state-of-the-art town with high-rises, with beach fronts, with lots of landscaping. And there they did an incentive to say, if you achieve 4 stars, we will allow you to build a little bit more. And all my clients who said, oh, wait, build more? Do you mean we build another floor as it is? And with that, we started making more efficient buildings, and the landlord gained while the environment also gained. So there are answers and ways to convince the developers, because development will continue no matter how sensitive we are to our environment. This is going to go until we convince them to do it in a better manner.
Thank you for that. Next question is for Bill. The United Nations network of organizations talk about sustainability, recycling, and waste control, etc. How do these long-used concepts fit into the concept of regenerative development?
Well, they certainly fit. We can't keep throwing away things and dumping more stuff into the atmosphere and the landscape, but they're not sufficient. So we must do them and must rearrange our lifestyles so that we're actually avoiding all that detritus. But that still doesn't change our relationship with life. So it's doing those activities and reshifting our perspective with our role with all the other life forms and living entities that are our brothers and sisters on the planet.
I have one more for you, Bill, from Caroline on Facebook. Can you share briefly another story of a project, just another one of your projects so you can share?
Whoa, which one's to pick?
I'll share Ecuador?
What's that?
Ecuador?
Oh, Chile?
Yeah, Chile, sorry.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. No, you know what? We're working on a wastewater treatment plant in Vancouver right now, and it's a gigantic piece of engineering machinery. But from the very beginning, we worked on we've done 2 plants in Vancouver now with a very profoundly interesting and professional design and engineering team. It's a 135-person team. And the first plant we did, the objective was save the taxpayers' money. The second one was save the orca whales. So between that plant and this one, the aim shifted from here to a plant to the system. And that was because of the work that we were doing with the community. So they saw this larger aim. And with that aim from the beginning, it took 18 months for the engineering team in the client's team to really understand that even though their mandate was to deliver a sewage treatment plant, in fact, it was to deliver a healthy ecosystem. And so this, from what I understand, I'm not sure about the treaty negotiations with Musqueam people, but it broke a logjam with them because now we are partnered, if you will, with Musqueam to actually heal the Fraser River and the Salish Sea, as well as 20 ecological projects are now mandated by Metro Vancouver to be addressed over the next 30 years of this plant engagement. So it went from doing a thing to actually working with the system. And the thing is just as important. The sewage plant's needed, but the fact is the social and ecological system have been incredibly improved and addressed. But it took 18 months of engagement before everybody in the design team woke up and realized, oh, this is really what we have to be doing. So change is hard, but it can happen. We just have to practice it. It's not episodic. It isn't because we come in and we have a great workshop or a great speech. It needs to be continually reinforced. And what's cool about these large projects is they allow us to do that. I'm complete.
Now, we've talked about the importance of regenerative education. We've talked about the importance of shifting cultural paradigms with regards to enabling regenerative development and regenerative processes to happen. With the notion of artificial intelligence and machine learning advancing across the planet, do you see a role that technology can play in supporting the evolution and emergence of regenerative development at scale? And I'll leave that question to Ibrahim first.
Definitely, technology can help, and we wouldn't be smart if we ignore the technology. But this technology also have to be learning from what was, from the basics in terms of environment and in terms of regeneration. So there is a lot that technology can add to us that can advance us more, to be more sensitive. We can measure the impacts that we are doing and to avoid what we shouldn't be doing in many ways. As a matter of fact, something is, when I talk to young students, they think, when I tell them to go back to basics and to learn from our ancestors, they think this is primitive and the technology will overtake that, but it's not primitive. I like what Anne said, the sensitivity to the environment. I mean, a Bedouin in the desert can, from the sound of the wind, can tell you what's going to happen, what the weather is going to happen, if it's going to rain. I'm sure it's the same thing everywhere. The divers, the old divers here in the Gulf, I was shocked when I read this. When they dive in the bottom of the sea, the pattern in the sand, they would know what type of fish was here breeding. All these learnings, the technology cannot give it unless we really feed the technology with it. So we know how to monitor it better, not to lose it, and to gain from this knowledge with the technology.
Thank you for that. I'm going to keep on that same question and shift to Anne, knowing that there's an incredible piece of work happening across the world that I know Oxford and MIT are involved with, where there's First Nations representation in North America, South America, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Australia that are developing a set of global protocols around indigenous protocols for artificial intelligence. So in that context, do you see the application of technology being useful in supporting your community, Anne?
Yeah, no, technology is very, very important because we come from an oral tradition. And so what we have been able to do is to take the stories of the elders and be able to record them in extensive cultural databases. We use the science, the technology to map the cultural landscape where people can fly over the river system and deep dive into a sacred place and learn about that place. So we see technology working very much to our benefit. It's an amazing thing because in a way it can also have like free thought. So when we're looking at technology, we also need to understand the artificial intelligence role and what that is doing in terms of capturing knowledge and how they are promoting knowledge. Knowledge has a value, wisdom has a value. So how are we making that exchange in terms of the reciprocity that I talked earlier on about circular economy? So it has been a wonderful savior in terms of being able to go into very ancient keeping places and bring back knowledge that has been deposited over the last 150 years from around the world, and to develop our own systems of intelligence where we can embed our cultural knowledge, our stories, our songs, all of the things that make us who we are and being unique as Indigenous people. So we see that very, very much up front. We also need to be very careful about how artificial intelligence is also being used to control and manage human beings. And so we need to be able to balance that, because one of the things we're talking about is not just power, but authority, and who makes those ethical judgments about what can and can be recorded, who owns the data, how is IP shared, how are cultural property rights recorded and valued, how is that embedded into the new economy. So yeah, it's all out there. It's very, very exciting. A lot of our younger people are very much in this technology era. They're very much at the very face of modern design. And so we are taking ancient wisdom, ancient stories, putting them into modern ways of sharing our stories, sharing the dream that we have, and we find that it's very, very powerful. But there also is a level of caution that when we're talking about artificial intelligence and who owns data, who controls, who can manipulate, what happens to data sovereignty, what happens to data genocide, all of these things really need to be thought about from an ethics framework as well. So values and ethics very much come into framing. How do we use the technology for the greater good of all rather than a few? How do we use the technology to map these very special places around the planet and show what it is we have before it can be unjustly developed? Thank you.
Another one on MS Teams for you, Anne, and you've mentioned storytelling quite a bit, and the importance. I mean, I see that Aboriginal people are the oldest living culture because of that storytelling and song lines, which we probably can't unpack on this call. It's probably too short, too long of a definition to unpack. But there was a series of dialogues that the Santa Fe Institute held a number of years ago between scientists and indigenous elders. And the complexity of storytelling from the elders and the analytical minds of the scientists was causing friction. This was probably 15 years ago. In your work now as a doctor and a researcher, are you seeing that reciprocity happen? Are there examples of how you're working with scientists right now to solve some complex issues in your community?
You know, exactly. And this is part of what I talked about a little bit earlier when I raised the idea of how are we imagining freedom? How are we managing to bring all these different groups together so that we can bring in this collective wisdom? So I'm working with amazing people right across the nation, right across the planet, particularly other Indigenous people, First Nations people from a wide range of backgrounds. And what it allows us to do is bring in, as I said earlier, multiple ways to have systems thinking, to be able to safeguard and bring in and develop and co-design how we unpack complexity. So from that perspective, yes, we are doing this. We are transforming our world. We are using technology in cultural mapping, in capturing songlines, publishing globally, nationally. We've set up a website. We're just about to go to a very big global event in about 4 weeks, which we will be using this technology to share the stories that we've made in a documentary, to show the work that we have been doing through our nation states and also between the different Indigenous nations. So very much out there, very much reliant on the fact that, as I said earlier, having lived through colonisation, we've gone from a world of euphoria and plenty to abject poverty. And what we're saying is that our freedom is very much dependent on being able to work with like-minded people who believe in our story, that believe that justice must be served not just to people, but to multi-species justice. And with all of that, what we're saying is that it's time to wake up the snake, look at how we do these things, and find that we need to connect globally.
Thank you for that, Anne. And that concludes our Q&A part of the talk. Thank you to the audience participants who made those really great questions for the panelists. I now want to leave some closing remarks, and we'll start with Ibrahim, if you can just give us some closing remarks.
Well, it's been a pleasure, a message that I take to myself and to everybody. I mean, with this famine, the corona thing, we already have learned a lot. Like Jason, you said, the swans are back in Venice, some people living in cities in China. Kids, the first time they know that there are mountains beyond these buildings because the sky is so clear. Just a question that we have to address to all of us. Do we need another famine, or God forbids an environmental disaster, because a famine will be a piece of cake if an environmental disaster happens. And we've seen some statistics by 2040, 2050s, at the way we are abusing our earth, our kids are not going to be able to live half as good as we do. We all have to work together to regenerate, to give back to this earth, so to keep it going for the generations to come. And it's a duty for every mankind to do so.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim, and thanks for participating today. Bill, can you please share some closing remarks with the audience?
Sure. I like to say, as a note of hope, that what we see when we work on projects, we see nature beginning to heal herself within 18 months of almost any activity, where we're actually partnering with her as opposed to trying to fix her. And so that hope is that I like to say that we can heal the world in 18 months if we actually partner with nature. And that requires us to, of course, fix ourselves to be willing to do that. So that's the journey. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Bill. And again, thanks for joining us. It's great to see you again. And closing remarks.
Yeah, my closing remarks goes back to my earlier point that it is a gift to be a human being. It is a privilege and an honor to be a human being. And so what I'm saying is that where we're going in our journey forward, I was actually transformed. My whole life was transformed when I went to America and I met a First Nations person, and I was going through some difficulty, and he looked at me and he said, "Do you realize you have the power?" And I didn't get it for a moment, but he said it again 3 times. And what he said is, "Do you realize you have the power?" And what he is saying to me, and what he said to me then, which changed my life, which I want to impart to the younger generation, is that in order to be a good human being, and in order to be a brave, we have to be brave and really extend ourselves, because where the world is taking us, we need to go in with good faith that we're there for the we, not the me, and the challenge to know that the Creator has given us something very precious with life to be able to think and conceptualize. And I'm saying, go out there, be a brave human being, let's do our bit and look at where we will be in the future, particularly in the next 2 to 3 years. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you so much, Anne. It's always inspiring and such a pleasure to hear you speak. So thank you for joining us today. That concludes this edition of the Education City Speaker Series. And I hope you'll agree that we've had some incredible dialogue and fascinating insights from our expert panelists on this concept of regenerative development and why it matters at both a local, regional, and global context. Thank you to all our speakers today for everything they have brought to this discussion, and many thanks to our audience for their participation wherever you are in the world, for tuning in and being part of this event. These events are prepared by a host of talented people within the communications team at QF, so a big thank you to all the people who helped make this panel and talk today happen. If this has left you wanting to find out more about Education City Speaker Series and the Qatar Foundation, please visit www.qf.org.qa. In the meantime, on behalf of all of us, goodbye and be safe.